I see a lot of familiar faces, but not everybody has a familiar face, so I guess I should introduce myself. This is why Yolanda didn't introduce me. I'm Donny. I'm an iOS engineer at Disney Streaming Services, where I work on an SDK that powers our Disney Plus platform. You can find me on Twitter with just my full name, Donny Wals. I blog on a website, which is also my full name, very easy. My free time, I like to play a little bit of guitar, learn new stuff, and share knowledge that I gain by just experimenting with things and learning the stuff that I also come here to share. So last year at WWDC, Apple announced a lot of cool things like SwiftUI that Jeroen just gave a nice talk about. It allows us to make UIs in a whole new way, and it's really kind of cool. And then there was also Combine, which allows us to do reactive programming in Swift without a third-party dependency. So now everybody can do it without having to convince their team leads that they need to take on this huge Rx Swift dependency, so that's great. And there's Xcode 11 with all of its new goodies, the previews and everything, all new crashes, all new bugs, all new problems. It's truly fantastic. It's a whole new world. And then there's Swift 5.2, which came out very recently actually, with also all kinds of new features, new bugs, new problems. It's very great. And then the simulator got a bunch of love recently, which I thought was fascinating with new controls. And then there's all kinds of topics that are great to talk about at a meetup to, give you something to think about. So you go to work tomorrow and you're truly inspired to go and do something cool because you learned this new thing at a meetup because, that's why we all do the work we do. But this is a bit much to talk about. So I brought my idea truck and I just threw all this in there. And I kind of just made the truck bounce a bit, just to shake it all up. And then these 4 topics came out for me. It's SwiftUI, because I dabbled around in that a little bit. I kind of liked the framework, but I didn't do too much in it, so I'm not great at SwiftUI just yet. And localization, because I think that is a very interesting problem that a lot of us have to solve in our apps and a lot of us have to work with. Swift 5.2 came with a feature that I'm not sure I like yet. It's called callAsFunction, so I wanted to talk about that today. I wanted to see where I could push that over the last few weeks. And then Combine, which is just a topic that I really like. So mixing these 4, I come up with the following talk. It's using Combine SwiftUI and callAsFunction to build an experimental localization system. I wanted to see if they could fit this on the introduction slide. Turns out they had to make the font a bit smaller, but they fit it on the slide here at CocoaHeads, so that's good. So what is an experimental localization system? First of all, it's one that I have not tested in production. I think that's important to mention, so I don't know how this works at scale. But what I really wanted to try was how can I use all these new features to make a localization system that whenever a user changes their localization preferences inside of an app, so not the system language, but really the app-specific language, how can I make it so that the app will automatically update without having to do any extra work? So that was a cool challenge, and I think it would be really cool if I can get that to work. So I started thinking about this, and I thought it's a bit of a 3.5-part problem. Part 1 is callAsFunction. It's brand new. It's not even out of beta yet. I don't even really like the feature per se. At least I'm not sure if I like it yet. So I have to find that out. That's a bit of a problem. Then there's SwiftUI. Not terribly experienced with it, but I kind of like it. And Combine, how do I fit that into this whole thing? I mean, this obviously is a good candidate for doing something reactive because I want to react to a change in the environment. But how do I fit that in? And then the half problem is localization, because that is more of a infrastructure problem, I think, more than a code problem. So, let's see how we tackle that. And I want to start with that localization bit, because that's, I think, the easiest and least interesting part of this. So I decided to work with a little JSON file that would hold all of my localized strings. It uses a key for the string that I want to get localized, and it has a dictionary in there with keys and values for languages and the translations. It's pretty straightforward, nothing fancy. Because I want to use it in code, I made it a data thing, so it's fake JSON. And so this fit my purpose really well. So next I would need an object that can use this JSON and do something with it. So that would be a localizer. So the first part of that localizer is pretty straightforward, I would say. It's just a class. I use a type alias because I really dislike having very long type names in more than one place. It's just a strings dictionary with keys for the localizable keys, and then dictionaries for languages and the translations. Pretty straightforward, matches to JSON perfectly. And then the initializer for the localizer takes data because, in a perfect world we would get this localized strings file from a server somewhere which will return data and we can throw it here. And then we decode the JSON into the strings dictionary. Now this is not truly fascinating yet. So let's move on a little bit. Let's see how we can manage the language settings and get the user's current preferred locale. So for that I wrote this class. And if we go through it bit by bit, we'll see that there is a locale publisher, which is of type local subject, which again is a type alias for combines current value subject. Now, a current value subject in combine is a special kind of a publisher, right? It will have a sort of a sense of state. It has a current value, which is a locale. And whenever we ask for a subscription on that publisher or on that subject, we will get whatever the current value is. And if that value changes in the future, we will automatically be notified and a closure will be executed. So that's sort of what we set up right here. Now the locale publisher, when we create that, we check if there's a user-defined locale. If there is, we use that. If there isn't, we use the locale current, which is the system setting. Because if the user didn't pick anything in our app, we're just going to assume they want to have whatever their system setting is. Now, the more interesting part, I would say, is the user-defined locale, especially the setter here. So the first bit is we just write that to user defaults, so we can store it and persist it throughout sessions. And then if we do get a new value, then we set the locale publisher's current value to the locale that matches that new value. If we didn't get a new value, because it's an optional string, we can also get nil, we set the locale publisher's current value to locale.current, which will send the current locale to our subscribers. So this object will allow us to get the current locale and be notified of future updates. And we need to integrate that with the localizer. So the updated localizer looked like this. These are the change lines. So we updated the initializer. It's not terribly exciting. But there are a lot more interesting bits to this that I'll show you now. I won't be adding it to this class because it will become very long. So I'm going to show you a bunch of short code snippets and imagine that they're all inside of this localizer class. So first of all, I already mentioned it, I don't like long type names. So I'm going to make a type alias that will hold on to this current value subject string never. This will be used for every localized string. So whenever we ask the localizer for a specific key, it will give us a localized string, which will publish the string that matches the current locale. If you're confused right now, that's okay. I will show how this works in a moment, and I hope that then you're less confused. We also need a couple of properties. One, to hold on to the dictionary of string localized string, which will be string is the key of the thing we want to localize. The localized string is the publisher. It's private because users of this object don't need it, but we need to do some bookkeeping because we want to reuse these localized string publishers if possible. And because in Combine we need to hold on to cancelable objects, we create a property for that too, because that is where we're going to store the cancelable that we get when we start subscribing to the locale publisher, which we do in another update to the initializer right here. So when we have the locale provider, we access its locale publisher and we subscribe to its value. And so whenever this value updates, this sync closure that we pass here is called, and we call it a self.updateSubjects here for locale. So what does that update subjects like? Because this will be called every time we get a value from the locale publisher. The first time it will be the initial value, subsequent times it will be the user's current locale. So this is what that code looks like. UpdateSubjects simply loops over all of the subjects that we've already created, so that's all of the localized strings, and it will set their new value. by calling translation for key, which simply looks up the appropriate translation for a certain key in our strings dictionary. So I hope that by now you can sort of see how this comes together in an object that looks roughly like this. I removed all the implementations for the methods, but we have an initializer where we start subscribing for the user's current locale, and whenever it changes, UpdateSubjects is called, and we send out the appropriate strings to our subjects. Now this is nice, but it doesn't do an awful lot yet, because we do have these type aliases, we have a bunch of properties, we have a bunch of methods. And if we think about all of these, there's one thing missing. We never really create any subjects. We never populate this subjects dictionary. And I left it out on purpose because this is going to be the most important part of our localizer, right? The way that we ask the localizer for subjects is going to be the public API. This is all private, like nobody needs to know about this. So how can we ask the localizer for values? Well, let's think about that for a bit. We could do something like this. We could create the localizer, and we could make the subjects sort of public and do a custom subscript or whatever, and then create subjects if they're requested and we don't have any, but I don't like this. I don't like this at all. And then there's this. We could define a get method on the localized strings, and that will take a key, and this get method would create a subject and return it. Not bad, but if we think of how Apple does this, it looks a bit more like this. Right? They create an instance of a special kind of string with the key that we want to localize, and then that is sort of magically transformed into a string. But because I don't want to have any global state or any shared state or any singletons, I don't think we can achieve this. Or can we? Well, it turns out we can with callAsFunction in Swift 5.2. Now, callAsFunction is a special feature that allows us to call objects or instances of objects as if they were functions. And all you need to do to support this is implement a function on an object called callAsFunction. This object can take as many parameters as you want. You can take none. You can have multiple overloads even, so you could have multiple flavors of callAsFunction. And it can also return anything you want. So we can implement callAsFunction on our localizer like this. So what we'll do is we'll look in the subjects dictionary to see if we already have a localized string subject for the key that we're asking for. If we don't, we create a subject, we figure out what the current value or the initial value should be, we set the initial value, we store this newly created localized string subject, and we return it. If we already have an existing one, we can of course return it straight away. And this little bit of magic allows us to write code like this, which, I don't know, I kind of like the way the code looks. I don't like the feature because now suddenly our localized strings instance, right, our object here, looks like it's a function. The API is pretty smooth though, right? We can just say localized strings, give it a key, and we can immediately subscribe to the result of that. And this will just give us whatever the value for the string is. If it's Dutch right now, we'll immediately get a Dutch string, and if the user changes their locale to English later, we'll get English. So that's very nice. Now, like I said, I'm not sure I like this, and I'm not saying that you should like this or use it like this, or if this is the best use case, but I do hope that this right here gets you thinking of how can I use something like callAsFunction to do interesting things and make APIs that are a little bit nicer than they were without it. Okay, so this is very, very nice what I just showed you, right? It's pretty cool, but how do I use this? Like, how does that look in context? I promised I would show you SwiftUI, and I will in a moment, but I'm pretty sure that you all are more familiar with UIKit than you are with SwiftUI. So let's look at a UIKit example first. Now you're just going to have to imagine that this view controller is all properly set up and everything is laid out as needed. But the interesting bit is right here. Because we have that localized string object in our view controller, we can ask it for a certain string. And I'm using combines assigned to on subscriber here, which allows us to use a key path of a certain object, and every value published by this publisher will automatically be assigned to that key path of that instance of an object. So in this case, the label's text is automatically set to whatever string is published by our localized string publisher. And because combine requires us to hold on to cancellables that are returned by subscriptions, we need to store this in the cancellables set, because if we don't, it will immediately be deallocated and nothing will ever update. So I really like this API myself, and I hope you do too. With just a few lines of code, we have a completely reactive localization system here in our view controller. So in SwiftUI, what we've seen tonight is that everything is easier, right? Everything is less code, everything is simpler. Unfortunately, this whole contraption that I built was harder to use for some reason. I'll show you. So the code here is fairly straightforward. We have an initializer that takes our localizer that can send us the strings that we need. And I initialize this strings object here. I'll show you what the strings object is in a minute. It is an observed object, and that's all you need to know for right now. We use this object in a nicer way than we did in UIKit, fortunately, because we can say strings.username. And this will automatically update every time the user's locale changes. I really like this. This, if you look at it, it's just, I want to get whatever the string for username is, and I don't care what it looks like. And that's, I think, the power of SwiftUI a little bit, is that it allows you to do everything very declaratively. Like, you remove all logic from the views, and it's all somewhere else. So in this case, it's in that strings object. So let's look at the strings object. I defined the strings object as an extension on sample view. And strings object is an observable object that takes the localizer, and it does roughly the same thing that I showed you in the view controller. It asks for localized strings, and it subscribes to it. But you might remember that I used assign2 in the view controller. So why am I not doing it here? Well, it turns out that whatever value is published by a current value subject, in this case an optional string, has to map directly to whatever the key path is on the object that I want to assign something on. And in this case, username or every other string is not optional, it's a non-optional string. So we could fix that by doing something like this. Right, that would look pretty neat. However, at this point, if you would do this, it would work fine. But using assign2, and you assign something to a key path on self, it creates a retain cycle in assign2. So that wasn't what I was looking for. So hopefully someday Apple will make this better in Combine, and we can write code like this. But for now, the safe code would look like this. And I have a couple of these publishers here. They're published properties. And the way SwiftUI works is if you have a published property on an observable object, every time the published property changes, so in this case, whenever we get a new localized string from our localized string publisher, then SwiftUI will automatically re-render the view. So this is what the whole strings object looks like. So every time we get a new value from the localizer, we set it to a property that is published on this strings object, and SwiftUI will re-render automatically. So here is the sample view again. And this is what a super simple reactive localized SwiftUI view could look like, with a nice little abstraction over Localizer. Now, are you ready for the craziest animation of the day? I know I am. That wasn't it. That's it. And so I showed you a lot of code and I talked about it. So I quickly want to do a little demo that shows you how the code works. So here is a screen built completely in SwiftUI. The locale is English, and whenever I click this button here, the locale changes and the view updates. So let's quickly go through the code. Here are the strings. Is this readable? Should I make it a little bit bigger? Of course I should. So here are the strings. Here is the locale provider. It's all just exactly the same what I showed you, really. Then we have this big localizer object, the callAsFunction implemented. We have just globally declared the locale provider and localizer, and then the sample view, It's the exact same sample view that I showed you earlier, just to show you that there's really no additional magic involved. Because I want to make sure you really believe that this is all that clean. With that, I'd like to thank you. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Would you recommend using a solution like this over the default and localized things and stuff like that?
Yes.
Also based on that you have automatically export function in Xcode, so you can find all those keys?
Yes. Because if you have a multi-platform app, it's often a lot easier to have sort of a centralized localization platform, like a third-party solution or something internal, that exports JSON that can be used by all the platforms, web, Android, iOS, all at the same time. And there's a little bit of a compatibility issue if you use iOS's localized strings. No other questions? Oh, yeah.
Actually, the system has the priority of preferred languages. How would you challenge that in this? Because now if the language is not the actual language of the user, let's say you're using the preferred one, it doesn't take that into account. It would just use the default language.
I would probably write code to do that. Like I said, this is very much of an experiment, so I just wanted to make it quick and make it straightforward. I'm sure you can read that preferred language and adapt the code in some way where it would use that. Yeah.
Plurals.
Plurals.
If you have, for example, 1x, 2x, 3x.
Yes.
Russian is also nice and annoying with those kind of values.
Yeah. Yeah, you would have to do some kind of a wrapping or, expand the localizer, because you can have multiple overloads with callAsFunction. So you could have maybe, the plurals in your JSON. You could have your localizer with the option like I want to have the single version of the plural version or whatever. So you could work with that. Yeah, definitely.
Indeed, and then the question is indeed, how do you know as a person every language that you support, what the language rules are for that? Like indeed, in Russian, I believe 1 to 4 has another postfix or prefix than 5 to 9.
Sure. To handle all of the pluralizations, I would say that's a little bit outside of the scope of what I'm showing here. And it's definitely a very tough problem that also I think is very nice if you have a custom JSON and a custom format. You can really have a person that knows all this, and you can adapt the system to whatever methods you might need for that.
Do you know if there are limitations to the amount of arguments that you can pass down in callAsFunction?
There are no limitations to the amount of arguments you can pass down in callAsFunction. It's just a regular function, and Swift really only cares that it's called callAsFunction, and it doesn't care about the rest of it. It's not like a function builder or whatever.
So you took us through the story how you implemented this in UIKit and then in SwiftUI, and SwiftUI was a bit harder. And this was your final kind of solution.
Yes.
Were there like in-between stages that you tried out and didn't really work?
Yeah, so I tried to fight SwiftUI for a while to see if it could work directly with a current value subject, because an @published property behaves and acts a lot like a current value subject. But for some reason, SwiftUI does not really want to have a binding to that, or maybe I tried to bind it wrong. That's also very possible, because I'm far from a SwiftUI expert, but it definitely wasn't easy to find out if a current value subject is directly injectable into SwiftUI. That's why I had to wrap it in this case.
Yeah, that was, yeah.
It would look beautiful if I didn't have to wrap it. Then it would be truly amazing.
Okay. Yeah. Cool.
No other questions? All right. Thank you.